In the spring of 2018, a man named Reed Callahan drove a dented Chevy pickup down a gravel lane in Crawford County, Arkansas. Parked in front of a limestone-floored smithy behind an old farmhouse, and looked at a cardboard box of mill files on a wooden workbench. He did not pick them up. He did not inspect them closely. He looked at the teeth, at the color, at the way the tang end had been dressed, at the heel, and then he set a $200 bill on the bench and said. He said nothing else. The man whose shop it was, Harold Voss, 68 years old, Crawford County native, retired toolmaker, a man known around Mountainburg for his silence and his memory for iron, watched Reed Callahan load 33 Nicholson Mill bastard files into a canvas duffel, walk back to the pickup, and drive away without looking back. Harry stood in the doorway of the smithy. His red heeler buck sat beside his boot, ears up. 18 months later, Reed returned. He set a kitchen knife on the workbench beside the forge, without a word. It had a Haman line along the edge, that faint, ghostly wave where hard steel meets soft, the signature of a blade differentially hardened in water, and the handle was wrapped in dark cord. Harry picked it up, tested the edge against his thumbnail, and set it down again. Then Reed named what he had done with Harry's files. He had forged 14 blades. He had sold 14 blades. The 14 blades had brought in $6,700. Harry did the math without a calculator. $33 per file in finished blade value against the $3 and change per pound that the county extension appraiser had said was all they were worth. This is the story of what that silence meant, and of the steel that earned it. Harold Voss had grown up inside the smell of hot iron. His father, Eldon, had run the smithy behind the house since the late 1932, doing plow-point work and gate hardware for neighbors, sharpening mill saws for the timber operations up in the Boston Mountains, keeping a hand in the old craft long after most county smiths had folded. Eldon was not a large man, but he had the forearms of someone who had been swinging a hammer since boyhood, and he kept his shop the way certain men keep their lives. Orderly without being clean, practical without being spare. Every tool had a place. Every steel was sorted by grade and use. The files had come in across a span of years, mostly from a hardware distributor in Fort Smith who carried Nicholson stock out of the Sheffield run pre-war manufacture. Eldon wrote down what he paid for them in a ledger he kept on a shelf above the forge, a brown composition book with a cracked spine. Files, 2 gross, February 1941. Files, 1 gross bastard, July 1943. He used some for deburring, some for shaping, some for draw filing flat stock. When a file dulled below useful, he set it in a box in the limestone cellar below the shop, rather than pitching it. Eldon believed in keeping iron. Harry had apprenticed in that shop from the age of 9, standing at the post vise on a milk crate to reach the work, learning to read the color of hot steel by eye before Eldon ever explained the chemistry behind it. The smithy was built from limestone quarried off the farm in the 1922, its floor thick slabs of the same stone that kept the cellar below it cold in summer, its forge a side-blast design with a hand-crank blower that Harry had graduated to cranking by the time he was 10. The shop smelled of coal, smoke, and scale, and the faint mineral smell of hot iron cooling on the stone floor. The color of steel as it heats through cherry and orange and yellow and white is a language, and the language is consistent, and a person who grows up reading it carries that knowledge the way other people carry the sound of a second tongue learned in childhood. It does not require explanation. It does not require certification. It resides somewhere below the level of thought, in the hand and the eye together, and it does not leave Eldon, had not been a man who said much. He believed that work spoke, and that speech was for when work could not be done. He had one saying that Harry remembered, spoken once in the smithy when Harry was 12, and had asked why they kept the old files rather than buying new ones at the hardware. Eldon had looked at the box of dulled files for a moment and then said, "A man who knows what he's looking at doesn't need a label." He went back to the forge. He did not elaborate. When Eldon died in 1985, Harry inherited the shop and everything in it. He kept the files in the cellar. He used a handful over the years, sharpening a hoe blade, cleaning up a weld, and he noticed what Eldon must have noticed. They cut differently from anything you could buy at the hardware in Fayetteville, finer. They left a different surface. He did not know exactly why. He kept them anyway. In 2007, Harry's younger sister, Norma, began pushing to settle the estate properly. There were taxes in arrears on 22 acres, and Norma felt the shop was dead weight, a liability, a drafty limestone room full of iron that nobody was using. She called Dale Pitcher, who worked out of the Fort Smith office of the Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service, and asked him to come out and assess the tools for disposal. Dale Pitcher was 52 years old, a vocational agriculture graduate from the University of Arkansas, 20-plus years appraising farm estates across the western counties. He drove a clean white pickup with the extension seal on the door. He walked through the smithy with a clipboard, making notes in the easy, fluent way of a man who had made these notes 1,000 times before. Dale was not unkind. He spoke carefully, explaining his reasoning as he went, because he believed in informing people of the facts. The problem was that Dale's facts were arranged inside a worldview that knew exactly what old tools were worth, and old tools were worth their weight in metal. "These files," Dale said, pausing at the wooden bench where Harry had pulled the box from the cellar, "are consumables. Scrap iron, no utility value." He made a note. Replacement cost for modern equivalents runs about $6 each. "These are worn below useful grade. I'd price the lot at $200 even for a scrap buyer. Maybe push $250 if you find someone cleaning out a shop." Harry looked at the files. He did not argue. "I know they were your daddy's," Dale said, and his voice softened the way it did when he was trying to be kind. "But sentiment doesn't carry at auction, Harry. It just doesn't." Norma looked at Harry. He thought about it for 11 years. What he thought about specifically was the quality of a file's teeth against the surface of a draw-filed piece of flat stock. He could feel it in his hands when he worked the old Nicholsons, a fineness of cut that left a surface the new files from the hardware did not leave. He did not know the metallurgical reason for this. He did not need to. The result was in the iron. In 2012, there was a meeting of the county's small farm and shop operators in the fellowship hall of a church in Mountainburg, called together by the Extension Service to discuss estate planning and equipment disposal. Dale Pitcher ran the afternoon session on tool assets. He was patient and thorough and had a printed handout that organized tools into categories: powered tools, hand tools, and consumables. Files and rasps were in the consumables column. Harry sat in the third row and did not ask any questions after the session. Standing in the gravel parking lot, he mentioned to a neighbor that he had kept his father's files rather than selling them. Dale Pitcher was 3 feet away, loading handouts into his truck. "Those would be sentimental odds and ends," Dale said, not unkindly. "Not worth hauling, most of them. The steel's been used down." He nodded at Harry with the patient expression of a man who had explained this many times. "Your daddy's memory lives in the work he did, not in the tools. That's the thing I try to tell people." Harry said nothing. He got in his truck and drove home. Buck met him at the shop door. Harry went inside and stood at the bench for a while with his hand on the box of files. Not working, just standing there. He moved the box to the cellar that evening. He put a padlock on the cellar door. Let me tell you about what those files were made of, because it is the thing Dale Pitcher could not see, and Reed Callahan could, and the difference between those two facts is the whole of this story. Nicholson file manufacture before 1945 used steel, the trade called W2, water hardening tool steel, a high-carbon alloy running approximately 1% carbon by weight, with trace vanadium mixed in during melt. The W stands for water hardening. You harden it by bringing the steel to critical temperature, roughly 1475 degrees Fahrenheit, the point where it loses magnetic attraction to a magnet held against it. Smiths call this the Curie point, the only reliable thermometer that does not lie. Then you plunge it into water, or brine, fast quench. The rapid cooling locks the carbon into a crystalline structure called martensite, a phase of steel so hard it will skate a file. And the carbon content of 1% is high enough that the resulting edge can be sharpened to a fineness that softer steels cannot hold. What the vanadium did was refine the carbide structure. Smaller carbide particles, more evenly distributed through the steel matrix, meant a finer grain and a more consistent edge. It was the difference between a gravel road and a paved one, at the level of crystal structure. Post-war Nicholson shifted to cheaper blanks and lower carbon formulations. By the mid-1970s, most American files were being produced from alloys that couldn't be reliably heat-treated to knife-quality hardness. The old ones were not better because they were old. They were better because the steel recipe had changed, and what remained from before that change was finite and unreplenishable. For a knifesmith, working in the tradition of hand-forged blades, old files are not junk. They are a source of W2 that no catalog currently supplies at consistent quality. You anneal the file first by heating it slowly to non-magnetic and letting it cool in the forge ash overnight, which dissolves the hard martensite and leaves the steel workable. Then you forge it flat, rind your profile, establish the bevel, bring it back to critical temperature, and quench again. What comes out is a blade. The Hammond line, that wave at the edge where the hard zone meets the soft, appears naturally on W2 when quenched in water. It is a record of the heat. It is one of the things collectors and chefs who buy hand-forged blades look for because it cannot be faked on production steel. The file's teeth are the first thing a knifesmith checks. The pattern, the cut angle, the color of the steel and the grooves. Experienced eyes can read the vintage of a file from across a workbench. Reed Callahan had those eyes. He had spent 15 years forging blades in a converted pole barn outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, selling kitchen knives to restaurant chefs and hunting knives to collectors at prices that began at $340 and climbed. He had learned to find old iron the way certain people learn to find old books. Not by announcement, but by paying attention to what gets left in old shops. If you want to understand what Reed Callahan recognized on that April morning in 2018, you need to understand what a file is, and what a file was. A mill bastard file is a flat steel tool with teeth cut across its face at a fixed angle, used for removing metal by abrasion. The word bastard refers not to the file's parentage, but to its cut grade. Coarser than second cut, finer than rough. Mill bastard files were the workhorses of pre-industrial metalworking, the tools that flattened a blade after forging, that cleaned up a saw plate, that dressed a bearing surface before fitting. They were consumed like sandpaper, used down, replaced. Nobody kept them, except Eldon Voss. The steel a file is made from must be hard enough to cut metal. That hardness comes from carbon content and heat treatment. The higher the carbon content, the harder the potential steel, and the better the edge it can hold and take. Nicholson had been making files in Sheffield, England, and in North Andover, Massachusetts, and the steel they used before the war was W2, because W2 was what the American tool trade had settled on, for cutting tools that needed to be hard all the way through. The whole file, not just the teeth. This is the thing Dale Pitcher's pricing model could not account for. The same steel that made a good file made a superb knife blade because the requirements were nearly identical. Hardness, edge retention, fine grain structure. When Reed Callahan looked at Harry's files on the bench, he was not looking at worn-out tools. He was looking at bar stock. Shaped bar stock? Bar stock that had been machined into file geometry and then hardened. But the steel itself was pristine. The teeth had been used. The steel underneath had not. Harry Voss's neighbor, Carl Briggs, one farm over, had faced the same question in 2009. 2. Carl's father had kept a similar shop, a slightly smaller accumulation of hand tools and iron, and when the estate needed settling, Carl did what the advice said to do. He called an auction house in Van Buren and sold the contents by weight and lot. The files went for $31. The old post vise, a Wilton leg vise that had been bolted to the same bench for 40 years, went for $40. Carl walked away from that auction with a few $100s and a cleared shop, and he did not know what he had given away until much later. And when he knew, he did not say so to anyone. Harry watched Carl's auction from the road. He did not bid. He went home and moved the files from the wooden box on the bench to the limestone cellar and put a second-hand door on the cellar entrance and did not talk about them. Megan Voss was 24 years old in 2019, 2 years into a materials engineering program at Arkansas Tech, and she arrived at her grandfather's farm for Thanksgiving, skeptical about most things, and, specifically, skeptical about the story Harry had told. She had taken enough metallurgy to know that tool steel specifications were a matter of chemistry, not age, and chemistry was verifiable. She had spent 2 years learning the science that Dale Pitcher had intuited without knowing its name, and her engineering education told her that an appraiser with 20 years in the field was more reliable than a feeling about an old box of iron. "Dale's not wrong, Grandpa," she said. "Steel is steel. If you don't have a certificate of composition, you don't know what you have." Harry handed her a file from the bench. "Run it," he said. He meant take a flake, get a sample. She looked at him for a moment, then put the file in her bag. Megan was not a person who liked being wrong. She had arrived at Arkansas Tech on a merit scholarship, had placed out of 2 introductory courses, and had the kind of mind that converted confidence into preparation, studying the things she intended to assert before she asserted them. So what she did over the next 2 months was not simply run the test. She also read everything she could find about the history of American file manufacture, about W2 tool steel and its formulation and properties, about the shift in domestic steel production during and after the Second World War. She found the Nicholson catalog histories. She found a 1944 trade publication that described the Sheffield run as running approximately 1% carbon with vanadium trace. She found a metallurgical paper from 1978 that noted pre-war American tool steel generally outperformed post-war equivalents on fine grain consistency. None of this told her what the files in her grandfather's cellar actually were. Chemistry is not established by provenance. Chemistry is established by testing. In March 2020, she ran a spark test first, because a spark test is fast and cheap and gives a preliminary read on carbon content. Carbon steel throws bright complex sparks with heavy burst patterns. The spark pattern from the file was bright. She did the spectrographic analysis the following week on a sample she had carefully cleaned and prepared, and the result came back with a carbon reading of 0.97%. Vanadium trace confirmed. The file tested as W2. She sat in front of that result for a long time. The number 0.97 was very close to the 1.0% cited in the 1944 Sheffield run description she had found. The vanadium trace matched. She had been trained to be precise and skeptical, and she ran the test again on a different file from the same box. The result was 0.94% carbon. Vanadium trace confirmed. She drove to Crawford County. She said, "What else is in the cellar?" Harry told her about the padlock. He got the key. The summer of 2018 was the year the Knifesmith supply houses started issuing quiet warnings. Several major distributors of high-carbon tool steel, the W1, W2, and O1 grades that small shop smiths relied on for hand-forged work, had been sourcing bar stock from overseas mills, primarily in China and India since the mid-2000s. Prices were lower. Delivery was reliable. The specifications on the invoice said W2 or equivalent. What the invoices did not say was that heat treatment results were becoming inconsistent. Blades were coming out of the quench at Rockwell hardness readings 3 to 5 points below what W2 should deliver. Some bars weren't reaching critical at the stated temperature. The steel looked right. It cut right on the grinder. It failed in the water. By 2019, several prominent custom knife makers had posted detailed reports online documenting the problem. The forum discussions ran for months. The consensus was that the offshore stock was mislabeled or inconsistently alloyed, that the vanadium content was low or absent, and that the fine carbide refinement that made W2 worth using simply wasn't there. Smiths who had trusted the catalog began sourcing alternatives: old files, old drill rod, old saw blanks, anything with a documented pre-war or early post-war American manufacture, anything whose chemistry was readable in the steel itself, rather than promised on an invoice. Reed Callahan had been watching this problem develop for 2 years before he drove to Crawford County. He had a list of shops and estates in western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma where old iron was rumored to exist, because he had learned that in certain counties the old shops had been kept, not cleared, by men who had the same instinct Harry Voss had, that what your father bought good was worth keeping. He found Harry's shop through a man in Mountainburg who had bought a file sharpener from Harry years ago and mentioned the limestone smithy behind the house. Reed showed up at the lane in April of 2018, with no appointment and no announcement, and he looked at the files on the bench, and he put $200 down and said he would take those. That was the second time Dale Pitcher's $200 figure had been named in that shop. Dale had said the lot was worth $200 even to a scrap buyer. Reed paid $200 without argument, and without inspection, and without asking about the weight. To Dale, $200 was the ceiling. To Reed, $200 was a price so far below the material's value that he didn't want to complicate it with negotiation. Harry understood this in the moment Reed walked away. He stood in the shop doorway and did not call after him because he had lived long enough to recognize when a transaction had told him something important, and he needed to think about what it was. Buck sat beside his boot and watched the pickup reach the end of the lane. There were 30 more files in the cellar. Harry closed the cellar door. The supply problem was not the only thing driving Reed's search. The bespoke knife market had grown sharply through the 2010 seconds. Chefs who understood edge quality had begun commissioning hand-forged kitchen knives from small shop smiths rather than buying Japanese production blades. Because the hand-forged blades, made from good steel and heat-treated by hand in a small shop, held their edge longer between sharpenings and could be reprofiled by the maker when needed. The restaurant knife trade, which had run on German and Japanese production steel for 40 years, was opening a lane for American craft blades. Reed had begun collecting orders faster than he could fill them. He needed material he trusted. In the fall of 2017, 6 months before Reed would drive down Harry's gravel lane, Dale Pitcher had come by the farm one more time. Norma had called him again. She was now 71, and her patience with the unsettled shop question had finally run dry. Dale walked through the smithy with his clipboard and his clean boots, and he stood at the workbench and said what he had said 10 years earlier, with the same even conviction of a man who was trying to be useful. "Harry, those are consumables. Scrap iron. Get something for them before they rust through." Harry looked at the files. He said, "I'll think on it." Dale made a note and walked back to his white pickup. He was not wrong about what he was seeing. He was wrong about what he was looking at. 6 months later, Reed Callahan drove down the lane and paid $200 for 33 of those files without saying a word more. And Harry sat with that fact through the night, a fire in the forge and Buck on the flagstone floor and the cellar door padlocked behind him. Reed Callahan spent 18 months forging those 33 files into blades. He worked through the box slowly because each file had its own history of use and stress. Some had been dressed hard at the heel and needed more annealing time. Some had minor surface cracks from years in a damp shop that he had to account for in the profile layout. He tested each one by heating a portion to critical temperature and quenching it in a small jar of brine, then breaking the test piece to examine the grain at the fracture. Fine and uniform, what Smiths call a tight grain, the signature of a steel that has been properly refined. He lost 4 files this way. Their grains too coarse to trust for blade work, probably worn harder from use and stress than the others. The remaining 29 yielded 21 usable blanks after he had annealed and ground them. 14 of those became finished knives. The process was not quick work. Annealing alone took 12 hours per file, heating in the forge to a bright orange, and then burying the blank in forge ash and letting it cool through the night. Morning revealed a piece of dead, soft steel that could be shaped by grinding. Reed ground each blank to his profile on a belt grinder, working slowly, dipping the steel in water every few passes to keep it below the temperature that would begin to harden it prematurely. He established the edge bevel by hand on a flat platen, holding his angle by feel and by eye. Then he returned each blank to the forge, brought it to the Curie point, and quenched it in a warm brine solution. The quench tank, a length of steel pipe, sealed at one end and set in a wooden frame beside the forge. Each quench took under 2 seconds. The decision about timing took 15 years of experience. After quenching, the blade went into a toaster oven set to 400 degrees for 2 cycles of 1 hour each to temper the martensite and relieve the internal stresses of the quench without giving back the hardness. Reed tested hardness by file. A properly hardened W2 blade will not be touched by a hardened file applied to the flat. The file skates. The steel is in control. The Hammond lines came out clearly on 9 of the 14 finished blades, that ghost wave of the quench front visible just above the edge. Reed photographed each of those 9 and posted the photos on the Knifesmith forum, where Megan had published her analysis. The response from the community was immediate. 3 of the 14 blades sold before they had handles. The 14 blades ranged from a slim chef's knife at 8 inches, sold for $340, to a heavy hunting knife, with a stabilized walnut handle at $850. The average across all 14 came to $480. 7 went to restaurant chefs. 5 went to collectors who specifically sought W2 with Hammond lines. 2 went to a custom knife dealer in Kansas City who called Reed the week after receiving them and said he could have sold twice as many, $6,700 total. That was the number Reed said on Harry's workbench in the early spring of 2021, alongside the kitchen knife. He explained the math without hurry. He named the steel, named the supply problem, and why it had driven him to Crawford County. Named what the Hammond line meant to a buyer who understood it. Named why his silence at the bench in 2018 had been the only rational response to a price that was already too low to negotiate downward. He told Harry about the 4 files he had lost to grain flaws, and about Megan's analysis and the vanadium trace that confirmed what he had seen at a glance. Harry held the knife. The Hammond ran the length of the blade like a waterline, lighter than the steel above it, darker than the edge below, and it was not decorative, not a pretense. It was the record of exactly what had happened to that steel in that moment, in that small shop in Oklahoma, a physical fact made visible. Harry set the blade flat on the workbench and looked at it without speaking for a long time. Then he told Reed about the seller. Reed's expression did not change, but he went very still. Harry said 30 files, different grades, some half rounds. Reed looked at the kitchen knife on the bench. He said, "What do you want for them?" Harry said, $18 each. He had done the math long before Reed arrived. At $18 a file, and at Reed's production rate, the files would yield roughly $270 in finished blade value each. Harry was asking for less than 7% of that. He was not trying to cut himself into a craft he had not done. He was naming a price that honored what the steel was without pretending he had done the shaping of it. Reed said, "That's fair." The number was $33 per file in finished value against the $3.17 per pound that scrap weight would have paid. The box of 63 files weighed just under 95 pounds. Scrap would have paid $301 for the lot. The files Reed had bought and forged had returned $6,700. The 30 in the cellar would yield in Reed's hands, and the hands of the 2 smiths he introduced to Harry that spring, another several thousand in blades over the following year. The 30 files in the cellar went for $540. Harry received a second finished blade. The following Christmas, a small paring knife with a handle of black locust wood from a tree on the property. He used it in his kitchen until the day he died. The total recovered from Eldon Voss's cardboard box of mill files, the ones Dale Pitcher had appraised at $200 in scrap value, came to $740 in direct payment to Harry, plus 2 hand-forged knives whose replacement cost would have been over $1,000. plus whatever meaning could be placed on learning that your father's instinct for iron had been correct for 80 years and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Megan's carbon analysis became the basis of a short research paper she presented at a materials engineering seminar at Arkansas Tech in the fall of 2022. She had spent the better part of a year gathering samples corresponding with 3 other Smiths who had provided vintage Nicholson files from their own collections and running the spectrographic comparisons methodically. The paper examined the metallurgical properties of pre-1945 American file steel and compared spectrographic data from 5 different vintage Nicholson files against certified W2 bars stock from 3 current suppliers. The pre-war samples outperformed the certified modern stock on carbide uniformity in 4 to 5 comparisons. In the 5th comparison, the results were statistically equal. The paper's argument was careful and specific. Not that old tools were inherently superior to new ones, not that domestic manufacturing was always better than imported, but that a specific category of pre-war American tool steel had specific compositional properties, and that this inconsistency had real consequences for craftspeople who depended on those properties in their work. It was a narrow metallurgical argument, not a nostalgic one. Megan had been trained to be precise, and she was. A professor in the engineering department sent the paper to a trade publication for metallurgists, where it was published the following year. A Knifesmith forum linked to it. The forum post was read by 1,100 people in the first week. Megan did not know until Harry told her. At the kitchen table the Thanksgiving she brought the first published copy to the farm, that her great-grandfather had written down the purchase of those files in a composition ledger in February of 1941. The ledger was still on the shelf above the forge. Harry got it down and set it in front of her, and she turned the pages carefully, reading Eldon's entries in their careful, slightly formal hand, the dates and the quantities and the prices. Files, 2 gross, February 1941, $4.2. Files, 1 gross bastard, July 1943, $2.85. She did not say anything for a while. Then she asked if she could take a photograph of the page. Harry said she could do better than that. Neighbors came. Word in the valley was that Harry Voss knew something about old iron, and people arrived with boxes and flat files and cold chisels they had kept in cellars and barns, because some instinct told them to keep iron, even if they could not have said why. Harry looked at what they brought. He held the files, checked the teeth pattern and color, sometimes draw-filed a small piece of scrap to check the feel of the cut. When the steel was right, he told them where to send it. When it was not, he told them that too, plainly and without apology. He charged nothing for the looking. Carl Briggs came one afternoon in the summer of 2022. He had driven past the farm a dozen times in the weeks since word had gotten around, and each time he had kept going. He stood in the doorway of the smithy with his cap in both hands, a 60-year-old man in a clean work shirt, and he told Harry about the 2009 auction without being asked. He named the $31 for the files. He named the $40 for the Wilton leg vise, a 68-pound leg vise that had been bolted to the same bench for 4 decades, which he had since learned was worth $350 to a machinist who wanted a proper working vise. The auction house had charged him an $11 fee, so he had cleared $29 on the vice net of costs. He did not ask Harry to tell him it didn't matter, because it did matter, and they were both old enough to know that pretending otherwise was not the same as grace. Harry pulled 2 stools from beside the bench and set them facing each other. He told Carl about W2 steel, what it was and where it came from, and why the timing had been what it was. Patiently and without hurry, the way a man explains something to a neighbor. He told him that Carl's father had bought good iron the same as Eldon had, and that selling it in 2009 was not foolishness. It was following the best information Carl had, and that the best information Carl had was wrong at the time horizon. He told him that Dale Pitcher had said the same thing to Harry twice before the world changed, and that Dale was a careful man who had simply not had the framework for what the files were. Carl sat with that for a moment. He nodded. He went home and came back the following week with 3 Nicholson half-rounds he had found in the back of the old shop, in a leather roll behind a piece of plywood, missed at the auction 13 years before. Harry looked at them. He ran his thumb across the teeth. He sent Carl to read. Dale Pitcher heard about the Knifesmith's visit in the way news travels in small counties, and he drove out to the farm one afternoon in the early fall of 2021 with his clipboard in the truck and his extension seal on the door, and he asked Harry to explain the W-2 situation away from anyone else, because Dale was a man who took his assessments seriously, and he wanted to understand where his reasoning had failed. Harry stood at the bench and explained the pre-war steel and the vanadium and the carbide structure and the supply chain problem, speaking the way he always spoke, in short, plain sentences, with room between them. Dale listened and took notes and asked 2 questions. When Harry finished, Dale said, "I didn't have the framework for it." He said it quietly to himself. As much as to Harry, he folded his notes and put them in his clipboard. He thanked Harry for his time and drove back to Fort Smith. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had believed sincerely and with 20 years of evidence that old consumables were worth their weight in scrap and that the weight of feeling attached to them was not part of the appraisal. He had been right in every other estate he had assessed. He had been wrong in Crawford County. There are 2 kinds of knowing. The first kind is wide and fast and systematic, trained across many cases and calibrated to the average, capable of pricing 1,000 toolboxes without missing once on the whole. The second kind is narrow and slow and particular, trained across decades on one piece of ground or one material, capable of recognizing a deviation from the average that the system was never designed to see. Both kinds are real. Both are honest. But they see different things, and they price different things, and what one calls scrap the other. Sometimes calls the only material left that will do what it promises. Eldon Voss bought good iron in the early 1942 because he had the second kind of knowing, and he trusted it. He kept it because he trusted it further. Harry kept it because he had inherited enough of his father's eye to know that what cut differently was differently made, and that different was not the same as worse. Reed Callahan drove from Tahlequah to Crawford County because he had the second kind of knowing honed to a point sharp enough to read an old file across a workbench and understand in 5 seconds what Dale Pitcher with his clipboard had missed in 2 visits. The steel did not change. The tools to understand it were what changed, and what changed was who was standing in front of the bench. On a November morning in 2023, Harry opened the smithy, got the forge drawing, and set Eldon's composition book on the shelf. He was not working that morning. He had not forged anything in 2 years, his shoulder having given out the winter before, and the shop now functioned as a teaching space when Megan came home, and as a consultation room when neighbors arrived with old iron. He kept the forge going anyway because the shop was cold. Without it, and because a smith's shop without heat is not a shop, it is a museum, and the distinction mattered to him. Megan had borrowed it for the seminar and returned it with a piece of tape across the spine to keep it from splitting further. She had also put her name on the inside back cover, below the list of file purchases, in the same column where Eldon had noted what he paid and when. Harry saw that, and did not say anything about it, but he left the book on the shelf where the light from the door could fall across it. Buck lay in the doorway in the thin November sun, one ear up. What endures is not what was best resourced or most efficiently priced. What endures is what was worth understanding, held by people who had the patience to understand it long enough for the world to come back around to what it had dismissed. The steel knew what it was. It only needed someone who could read it.